big thank you to everyone who's joining us on the call today. If it's your first masterclass, welcome. So today we're really thinking about resident engagement. So we're thinking fundamentally why it matters. We're trying to understand previous funding streams and therefore how that has aided our understanding about where we are right now. Some of the different engagement stages that you and your organisation will probably go through. The who is really important here, so thinking about those stakeholders, who within your portfolio, your estate. You might have 10 properties, you might have 20,000, you might have 90,000. There's a whole size and scope and kind of scope, and we're trying to understand that actually all of those matter. And we can apply some of the understanding here to mean that your retrofit project will be a success. We're thinking about those methods, about how we can possibly do it. Absolutely thinking about some of those key considerations. Thinking about maybe a use of a checklist as something useful as a tool for you to think about. Then thinking about some of the RISE support that we can offer additionally to this. So thinking about some of the different elements like toolkits, recorded masterclasses, and you'll have links on some of the slides later on. So I'd like to start off always with why this is important. It is absolutely kind of essential to getting that successful implementation of a project. It's really important to think about retrofit as something that is being done with for people rather than something that is being done to the building that they live in. Reframing this is really essential in terms of building in that success. People absolutely have an emotional connection to their homes, whether they are tenants, whether they are owners, whether they are owner-occupiers and kind of rent it out, and everything in between. When we're thinking about a retrofit project, it's thinking about the control that we have. And feeling like we have less control over major decisions can be a really emotional process for people to be kind of going through. Being clear and open and engagement with people can absolutely help make that whole process much easier for everyone involved in that. So we're thinking about, if we've got a certain level of disruption that might take place. Disruption will mean different things for different people as well. It might mean scaffold up for several months for some people. It might mean a week or two of disruption to fit a heat pump. And everything in between. So understanding what that disruption means to people can be really important when we're thinking about developing our approach. Importantly, one of the key things is really understanding, and maybe you might be on the call and you have full appreciation of sometimes when it's gone wrong, how that might have arisen, but it's understanding that if that hasn't been your experience, thinking about how can we make sure that we don't have things go wrong. We can plan as much as possible, but sometimes things will still go kind of a little bit challenging, shall we say. So really thinking about resident engagement and putting people at the heart of things. It's absolutely, for any retrofit project, regardless of scale, size, complexity, is around people at the focus of that. So when we look at some of the data, 2/3 of residents across all tenures don't actively consider retrofit improvements. Of those who are not considering any improvements, the most common reason for this is they believe their home was already efficient enough. That's around 35%, so just over 1/3. Followed by not owning their own home, so different tenures bringing in, and changes costing too much money. So all of that is taken from data from the UK government from 2022. An assumption that all homes are the same. Homes absolutely change and adapt over a number of years, meaning that actually a bespoke solution is going to be needed for every home. And how we can kind of think about this is thinking about trying to identify house typologies with similar characteristics. Also, really taking on board direct resident feedback and/or input. So the understanding about, certain gable ends, for example, or certain heating systems, Getting that knowledge, getting that data, really important here. A lot of people will have a focus of that cost benefit, and that needs to be really clear. When we're thinking about it in the context of homeowners, it needs to be part of that that discussion, that open dialogue around convincing the point in case. So thinking about this measure is going to show certain improvements. We might bring those elements of cost into that. Retrofit is often applied on a pay-as-you-save model, but also it needs that long-term clarity if we know, particularly for homeowners, that there is that long-term plan, that long-term benefit to really think about. But ultimately, with any retrofit project, what we are trying to do is think about the thermal comfort of that property. In winter, we absolutely want to be at a nice level that is going to be comfortable for us. And in summer, it's not going to overheat. So all of those things come in, and that level of thermal comfort is a real important element. Different people will have different requirements in terms of that. So we bring in ideas of vulnerability, age. So young children quite often need a warmer space than, say, adults of a working age. Likewise, if there are disabilities or particular health needs, thinking about how those are going to play a part, and then using that to inform your strategy that you pull together. So when we think about, we're developing this strategy, long term, we're thinking about retrofitting, who are we going to need to engage with here? It might be that there are a multitude of different stakeholders involved here. It might be resident community groups. It might be neighbours. It might be planning committees at the local council. There's a whole range of different stakeholders that for each project will probably be a little bit different. So thinking about things like, what do you want to engage them with? Is it about the whole scale strategy of the retrofit or estate improvement? Is it about just talking to neighbours for a private home, for example, about there'll probably be a lot of vans parked on the street? There's lots of different levels that we need to be really thinking about. Absolutely, timeframes comes into that. Is it going to be implemented in 6 months? Is it an 18-month project? Is it a one-off couple of weeks that's going to take place in September? Thinking about all of these details is going to be really important in terms of thinking about that approach to your project for retrofit engagement with the residents that are there, the residents that are neighbouring that. If it's a wide-scale estate development project, thinking about how all of those individuals are going to be part of this resident engagement piece. Understanding that monitoring and analysis of that data is also going to be really important. So depending on what your project is, how are you going to measure that resident engagement? Is it going to be about number of people who turn up to a community event? Is it going to be responses to questionnaires? And then it's everything in between as well. Also, a key thing to really think about here is what does that success look like? When we're talking about resident engagement, we want it to be a positive process. We want to make sure that it's, again, something that isn't being done to someone. It's part of the process. So really think about, what does that success look like? It might be, if you are a social landlord, that this might be around tenant scores that you get on a yearly basis. If you are a local resident, it might be around complaints about certain elements. So really think about all of those things and how, for your project that you are thinking about, how is this going to be something that I need to be considering for it? An important piece of this is really understanding that actually we've had multiple years of different funding streams that various organisations, individuals, councils have been able to tap in that come under that broader kind of title of funding for retrofit. So really thinking about, okay, well, actually, here's what we've learned from some of these past sessions. So these are just two examples, and you might have some other examples. And we do really love to hear from different people around their experience, what has kind of worked, what hasn't worked, what they would like to try. So if you do have any examples at the end when we have time for discussion, it'd be really great to hear some of those. So do feel free to share that. The two examples we've got here are quite typical ones that we've come across, particularly with previous iterations of funding. So example one is a resident liaison officer had close and trusted relationships already with the residents and was able to provide that, what we've called kind of a holistic service in terms of being able to answer questions, not just about the project, but wider issues about kind of overall well-being, about mental health, about the timelines, as well as, and for a lot of residents, so this will have come from a social landlord, about the technical details of that build. So that trusted source of someone who is almost already embedded in the local community, being that key advocate for that project. So that's a really nice example, particularly if you are a social landlord and you have that kind of system in place. The second example is kind of thinking about it in a little bit more detail, in a very kind of bespoke lens. So thinking about when retrofit has been done in phases, thinking about how that is going to work for the benefit of tenants and their understanding about what that project is. So thinking about things like, what does a heat pump actually look like? You know, on a piece of paper, it can describe it in a certain way, but for many people, they are visual learners, and therefore seeing it, particularly in situ on a house that maybe, or flat that looks like theirs, is going to be a really powerful way of getting that through. So thinking about it in terms of understanding where that can sit. It can really help with getting those sign-ups as well. So I've seen projects where they've had like a pilot house that has been improved in terms of insulation. They've taken out the gas boiler. It's got a heat pump in. People being able to see what the insulation looks like. You know, if it's external wall insulation, seeing what that finish looks like, but also seeing what that heat pump looks like. For a lot of people, it's about seeing what the controls looks like. Coming back to this issue of thermal comfort, really important, and people being able to feel like they are in control. So again, that visual seeing, understanding that, you know, another tenant particularly has had that done, and it works across the board as well. You'll see this with particularly private homeowners, where you will see solar panels appear, and then you'll see more solar panels appear on roofs as people see what it looks like. That can be a really powerful motivator for that. So the two examples we've got there have come from the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and a whole house retrofit fund as well. So these were, if you're not aware, they were funding streams which had a kind of focus and rationale for local authorities and social housing providers to implement that whole house approach for retrofitting of homes. These examples used interviews, kind of project reporting, the use of project teams as well, and really kind of understanding how the funding was really helpful in kind of enacting these projects to be able to come through and having resident engagement as part of that process, not just an afterthought, but being integrated into the whole scheme. Obviously, we have those positive ones where people see something that looks good and they're like, yes, I'll sign up. We also have to appreciate that actually still, with information, with guidance, some people will actually still refuse opportunities for improving their home. Particularly, we find from the research that it is older people who prefer not to have that disruption. Scaffolds being up in particular can be, you know, very disruptive. Particularly over winter, it can make things a lot darker and therefore needing to have the lights on for longer. Thinking about it in terms of vulnerability and accessibility, this can be a worry, a challenge, but I would flip that and say that it's also an opportunity to explore how to understand that accessibility for the homes. Long-term residents, quite often we see, will have a sentimental value attached to that place that they call home, and seeing change happen can be something that they don't necessarily want to happen. So understanding that, again, that emotional side of homes really comes into it. And also things like mistrust of landlords. So particularly thinking about the kind of social housing element, thinking about local authority. If there have been problems in the past, not necessarily as retrofit, but it could have been around roads, connectivity to a particular area. It could have been around kitchen replacements, where something has gone wrong, and therefore that negativity around that is then informing the decisions about whether to do a retrofit project. So again, what we're thinking here is around understanding people, understanding some of the challenges that might come forward. So knowledge, understanding, really, really important here. So we've thought about some of the challenges. These will be different across the board, whether you are an individual house owner or whether you're a large social landlord. It's really thinking about how to think about how I'm going to engage in terms of people. So rather than the technical bit, it's about the people. As always, we would recommend that any strategy should be something that you can be really specific with. So hopefully you might have come across SMART before. This is used quite a lot across the board to make sure that the objectives of what you're trying to do are going to kind of come to fruition, because we want this to go ahead. We want it to be positive. So making sure that it is specific, so that's the S. Making sure we can measure it as well. So this might be a numerical, it might be an opinion piece, it might be numbers at a community event, whatever it might be. It should absolutely be something that is achievable. We could think of all sorts of different objectives to put in here, but if actually we're never going to achieve it, it might need a rethink. So thinking about, okay, well, we can do it. Linking to that, it then needs to be realistic. So if we wanted to say something like, having a resident liaison person, 1 in every 10 homes, it might be realistic, it might not be. So again, really thinking about how to make it very specific and absolutely making it time bound, making sure that we have a closed point at which we are kind of putting this strategy forward, assessing what those the outputs and the kind of objectives will be. So combining all of these together to really push forward that really great strategy. Those of you who have joined Masterclasses previously might recognise this flowchart. It is also available in the Resident Engagement Toolkit, which we have links for at the end. If you are new to this, then please do kind of take note of this slide in particular. Really useful in terms of understanding those different stages and making sure that all of them completed and that they are addressed. Excuse me. Timeframes will vary depending on your project. So again, really starting at the beginning with that engagement planning, we're thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? Recognizing that organizational need for that, thinking, okay, well, how are we going to do this? We then think about, okay, we need to raise awareness of this. Really thinking about, what is this going to kind of look like? Are there websites? Are there social media? Are there leaflets? Are there community sessions? How are we going to do it? The launch is then the kind of, this is the project. This is what is going to go forward. We've already had 2 stages before, but this is about that launching. This is our retrofit project. This is what it is going to entail. We're going to have our SMART elements in there. So making sure that it is time bound, that we can measure it, and that it's very specific, that it is going to be something that is going to be achievable, and it has that element of being realistic. For large scale projects, it's about thinking how the timescale is going to work. It's including things like, if work is going to take place over winter, how will the weather have an implication on that? understanding from previous projects, it might be a new build project, understanding how that might have an implication for residents, for the contractor, and for other stakeholders as well. The design, so then the middle bit, is around that adaptation that we might need for particular residents. So understanding that as part of resident engagement, we might have people who need information in Braille or a different language, or you might have offline residents. Really thinking about, okay, how are we going to do this? Also thinking about how that vulnerability, the specific nature of the residents, is going to impact on your strategy and the retrofit project itself. It's also thinking about certain religious key kind of milestones, avoiding particular elements. I've worked in construction for several years, and if we had a project that was near a place of worship, we always used to go and check if there were any particular sessions that week that needed to kind of have a quiet stage. So, for example, things like funerals, making sure that there was suitable parking around that place of worship. So again, make it really specific to your organisation, your project, because then when you get to that installation, it's really about that minimising disruption to residents. Parking, I've already mentioned, but comes up quite a lot. So really thinking about where site compounds might be. Are there going to be dedicated areas? Is there going to be loss of parking? There are other examples here, but parking is a really hot topic quite often in resident engagement. So our project's gone through, we've been successful, we've kind of worked through processes. The handover is a real essential piece. You know, how are we going to make sure that that resident or that tenant who is in that property has all the information that they need, has had opportunities to answer questions, that the retrofit measures that have been applied understood by that tenant. We also want to consider that actually if there has been a tenancy change, where we need to catch up with that potential new tenant. So again, really making sure it's in understanding. If we have people who are, love a kind of paperless kind of way of having information, how are they going to access that? Is it going to be QR codes? If they are offline, is this going to be a manual that they're going to have in their premises? So really think about all of the options. Postworks is then that last piece. It's really that evaluation. It's following up on residents, particularly when we've got heating changes or updates. So this might be controls, it might include replacement, whatever it might be. Make sure that after a whole season of heating, for example, that you catch up with those residents to understand, has it worked? What were the challenges? Have there had to be lots of maintenance calls out because of an issue with the software, with an issue with the mechanical features, whatever it might be? Making sure that post-works element is really included, particularly for satisfaction, but also around how this project has gone. And making sure that it is all part of this. Like I said, you can find that flowchart in the toolkit. We do have the link at the end. When we're talking about large-scale retrofit projects, private or public sector, what we've got to make sure is that we are following the best examples from the sector about how to do that. PAS 2035, and we have lots of other masterclasses on this, so if it's new to you, please do go and have a look around that. Is often a requirement of key bits of the government funding. So particularly the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and certain streams in the eco funding really needs to comply with what is the PAS 2035. A PAS is a publicly available specification. So this is something that you can find, and you can search for this after the session and see and get some more information, or come along to any of our future masterclasses on this. It's making sure that the contractors that we are utilising in our retrofit projects have that level of understanding about why residents matter. So crucially, it's things like the well-being of residents is central to that planning and installation works programme. It's also thinking about making sure that people are consulted around this. So those are two of the requirements. There are other ones, but making sure that that is kind of understood fully about that. If this is entirely new to you, please do have a look at some of the masterclasses we have coming up, some of the details around that, which will really help you with future funding, as well as any existing works that you might have. When we're thinking about people, we're thinking about our stakeholders. There will be internal ones to your organisation, there will be external ones. And depending on your project that you are doing, these will potentially be a really big list, or it might be quite limited. But here are some of the kind of key ones to really start thinking about. Communications teams absolutely can be really essential in helping support you. You might have a resident liaison team, you might have one person, you might be the resident liaison person. So again, thinking about, okay, where does that fit? Whose roles and responsibilities does that align with? You might very well have a customer contact centre, so you might be a local authority where it goes to a particular telephone number and then it gets diverted out. Thinking about those people who are working in that team, how are they going to fit into this retrofit project? You might also have in-house energy advisors, absolutely fantastic work that they do. Again, making sure that they are represented in any of the stakeholder engagement. You might also have an internal retrofit coordinator. The retrofit coordinator role is one of the key roles within PAS 2035. So again, understanding where that is for your organisation or your particular project is going to be really important to consider here. Externally, and this isn't an exhaustive list, just a kind of highlight for now, the installation contractor. So who's going to be doing, say, the wall insulation, for example. Linked to that, you might have in your contract with your contractor that they should be the ones supplying the resident liaison officers. So making sure that that person who has had that role assigned to them is part of this stakeholder engagement. If the retrofit coordinator is external rather than internal, making sure that that is really important. You might also have some very bespoke, very specific external energy advice here. Particularly if you have a challenging retrofit project, it might be a historic building, there might be limited access, there might be very vulnerable tenants. Whatever it might be, thinking about that external person who's going to be really important to this. I've said this before, but absolutely putting people at the heart of it is going to be essential. We have that emotional attachment to our homes. If you don't already know the residents who will potentially be impacted by a retrofit project, now's the time to start having that dialogue, having that discussion. Be really clear and transparent on that information that is going forward about what will take place. So again, things like access, time of day operations, if there's going to be something like scaffold going up. I've never mentioned scaffold before, but quite often that comes up as something that, people don't like to see because it is kind of quite disruptive. Making sure everything is very clear, simple to understand. I often think if you explain this to your grandparents, how, would you get that message across? Likewise, if you share that information with a 5-year-old, would they understand what you were talking about? So really think about the way that language is being communicated and thinking about that approach for each resident. We are all individuals. Everyone on this call is an individual and we have different needs. Some of us will be really, love data and seeing all that information. Some of us will love seeing the technical information of things like the manifolds, the diverters, where exhaust will come out. Some of us will just like, okay, well, is it going to make me feel warm in winter when I want it to be? Yes, brilliant. So again, really have that individual touch to everything and making sure that information isn't just a one-time event, that it flows throughout the project. So like that flow chart we saw a couple of slides ago, making sure that it's very much a flow understanding that there will be feedback points in that, but really making sure that we're putting people at the heart of things, and that information is going to be available to people to understand, to research themselves, and really understand the process that it's going through. The why is really important here. So this is just an example of some of the data around fuel poverty. So this might be one of your motivators for doing this retrofit project. It might be around addressing that particular issue. If you look at it in terms of the household composition, this is really important in understanding it. So single parents had the highest proportion of households in fuel poverty, and couples under 60 without children had the highest average gap. So again, really thinking about, are those the demographics that are going to impact me in my project? Do we have that profile? Just thinking about, okay, is this something to be kind of recognizing and understanding for our elements? Are children there? Are retired people? Are single parents? Again, bringing all of these understanding pieces into your work is going to be really, really important. Households with the age of the oldest member between 16 and 18 also have the highest likelihood of being in fuel poverty. So again, people who are kind of on the younger spectrum here, 16 to 24, having that highest challenge. Is that something that applies to you in your project that you're kind of thinking about? On the terrace that maybe you are addressing, are they very kind of younger people? Is there a mix? You know, how are you going to really address this? And pulling forward this data can be really useful in helping senior management get engaged. So again, that's part of the stakeholder engagement. And also kind of providing that information to your contractors, to your internal colleagues as well, to really embed that idea of this is why we want to do it. This is what we want as successful outcomes. And this is that broader target that you might have as an organizational strategy. When we're thinking about that communication, one piece of communication is never going to be good. We want to have these multi-layers to make sure that as many people are going to be kind of captured in that resident engagement piece. So we've kind of pulled together some of the ideas here, and again, others on the call today might have some really great examples. Thinking about where we engage with different agencies and different organisations. So health is a really great one. You know, pharmacies are such a great resource for people to be able to go into with minor ailments. Are there notice boards? Are there places where leaflets can be dropped? GP surgeries as well, linking in with NHS trusts around social prescribing, for example. Occupational therapists, so again, thinking about vulnerability, people recovering from injury perhaps. Hospital discharge teams as well, making sure that if someone is potentially in hospital and then they're going to be returned to their home at a particular stage, if that is during a retrofit project, how is that going to be managed? We also think about things like education, so schools, councils, that's primary and secondary, and any other kind of educational setting that could be really useful. Thinking about that governance piece, so we might have things around maintenance teams, and we might have things around social care, as well as linking in with environmental health teams, particularly around HSSRS. Council tax, again, it might be a useful way in with kind of a local authority. And also thinking, okay, we might have done a project before, we might have had hard to reach tenants because maybe they work nights, they have a particular mental health issue that means that they won't answer the door. So if door knocking's been employed, really thinking about, okay, how can we communicate with all of our tenants, remembering everyone's individual, remembering that people at the heart of it, and thinking, how can we do this in a real positive way? In terms of the methods, again, we're going to kind of pull this out a little bit more. Really understanding what people want to know. they'll need to know or want to know timescales. They'll want to know if a render is going on the top of the external wall insulation, what colour that is. When will people want to know this? What timescales do we need to kind of involve in this? How will people actually want that communicated to them? And we did a project last year where, as part of the suite of resident engagement, text messages were sent out to residents. And then we had a feedback session in a community hall. And what was really interesting is a lot of the residents that came to that community hall session said they didn't respond to the text message because they'd been worried that it was spam. So they were worried that it was a kind of a phishing attack and that it was asking them to click in the survey. And so it's understanding that actually it can be a really good plan for lots of people, but there might still be this group of people who, again, maybe don't trust that system. So therefore a leaflet, that face-to-face trust can be a really interesting one to consider as well. So think about all of those different ways. What works well? What historically in your organisation have you had as well? So we've got a couple more slides before we'll have time for a bit of a discussion. So again, think about those considerations. Start with the why. We might be wanting to address thermal comfort. It might be around carbon. It might be around increased efficiency. It might be part of a wider community improvement. Be upfront as well. Be very open and transparent, particularly around timescales. Also, if this is likely to slip, make sure those updates are being provided. Think about concerns. Think about the use of automatic reminders as well. It might be that actually house access is needed on a Tuesday. Remind them on the Friday, remind them on the Monday, so that people aren't kind of shocked by things that might come through. And really think about those multiple communication avenues that you can explore that really supports building trust, establishing trust, or just reinforcing that trust that you might already have within your organisation or that particular area. So this is not an exhaustive list, again, just some examples. You'll get these slides so you can have a look at this and kind of amend to your specific needs. So thinking about, okay, well, do we have a website? Is there a phone number? Is there an email? Do we have a particular brand for this? Do we have all our team who've been DBS and safeguard trained? Are there particular issues around kind of referrals or external training opportunities? Thinking that last stage, do we have that feedback loop incorporated into our strategy? How does it all fit together? So these are just some examples that you can kind of start to think about. Again, you might have examples that you have already utilised that have been really successful, and that would be great to hear about those. This is just one example. I'm sure lots of you on the call will have other examples, but this is taken from a borough council where they had a bespoke retrofit engagement strategy implemented in 2022, so 2 years ago. They had pre-engagement updates to the residents. So those people who were going to be impacted, disrupted, have that improvement were having that kind of pre-engagement element. So really kind of putting it back before the kind of installation dates. Really nicely, they included some of those kind of wider community benefits. So things like weekly coffee mornings, fish and chip lunches, afternoon teas, as a way of maintaining that engagement, having that open dialogue. The face-to-face element was really important here. And in terms of that measurable piece, what I really like here is that when they measured the improvements, they saw a 90% improvement in their energy bills. So that's a really nice figure that they can kind of respond to. Avani has just put up another, well, it's a word cloud one this time. So please do feel free to put your comments in there. We do always appreciate your feedback and your comments. In terms of additional support then, we have gone through a lot of detail here. You might have questions, queries. What I would absolutely say is do reach out to us, but also think about the other resources that you can access. These are all available to you. It's all based on the RISE website. So there can be some particular ones around bespoke support. There's a self-assessment you can do. And there are toolkits as well. There are masterclasses. So we've got future masterclasses that will be delivered live like this one, or there will be recordings. So again, this one's being recorded. You can share that with your colleagues or interested people to kind of listen along at their own time. We also do a range of podcasts, and we are soon to launch a range of courses and other modules that will do a slightly deeper dive. Also support people who've been doing lots of retrofits, throughout their career, as well as people who are brand new to it. So please do come along and have a look at that. What I would say is ask questions. Please do get in contact with us. So you can email rise@turntown.co.uk, and we have dedicated colleagues who look after that inbox, and it gets kind of disseminated out to the most kind of appropriate people. If you would like to email me, that would be fabulous. I always do like to hear from people. And likewise, we have the website at the end, which is riseretrofit.org.uk. So do go have a look at that and kind of explore some of the more details that will really help you with your project.